And to start us off here, I plan to talk about the work that we've been doing directly with cities over the course of the last year, and also talk about the specific opportunities that EV car share presents to cities in addressing affordable, equitable mobility, especially for multifamily homes. And to kick us off, we have a poll to learn a little bit more about who you are and what you're interested in terms of your community mobility. And so, with multifamily homes, they're both unique opportunities and challenges. But just to take a step back first, cities are increasingly focused on transportation right now because it sits at the intersection of a lot of different challenges: emissions, affordability, access, housing, limited urban space. And just to start off with the first one, transportation is one of the largest sources of emissions in most cities. Across the US as a whole, private vehicles alone account for about 20% of total emissions. And so, because most Americans live in urban areas, for cities to meet their climate goals, they have to address how people get around. To build on that, though, as I'm sure most of us have noticed gas prices lately, the cost of car ownership is increasing. Between vehicle payments, insurance, fuel, maintenance, parking, owning a car is becoming more and more expensive. Right now, the annual average for owning a car is about $12,000 a year. And a lot of this is due to insurance premiums. Those have risen by about 55% since 2020, largely due to vehicle and repair costs increasing. And so, unfortunately, for many households, transportation costs are becoming a real source of financial strain. What you can get from this is actually a really negative feedback loop where this lack of mobility reinforces economic hardship. And what I mean by that is that transportation is fundamentally about access to jobs, healthcare, education, childcare, groceries, you name it. Whenever transportation becomes too expensive, too unreliable, too unavailable, people's ability to reach those opportunities is severely limited. And these challenges are really acute for people who are living in multifamily housing. In urban areas, a significant share of residents often live in apartments and other multifamily buildings. And while solutions like biking, transit, walking, and micromobility can meet a lot of trip needs, they often don't meet every transportation need. Some trips really do still require the flexibility of a car. But at the same time, personal vehicle ownership isn't always a practical or affordable solution for multifamily residents. Parking may be limited, expensive, or just unavailable. Um, and a lot of times, households may only need a car once in a while, making full ownership of a vehicle a really inefficient solution. One thing that this is tied to as well is that parking requirements also increased housing costs generally. Studies have shown that requiring a parking space for every unit in a multifamily development can increase costs by about 12.5%. Bring that up to two parking spots, you bring costs up 25%. And so this is compounded with the fact that cities have limited curb space and vehicles often spend about 90% of their time parked. But the one thing I want to mention here before moving on to the next slide is that there's also a growing equity challenge around the EV transition. And what I mean by that is that multifamily residents often face barriers because installing charging might be difficult or even impossible for them because they might not own their building or control their parking space directly. And so, without targeted solutions to help these residents, unfortunately, they risk being left out of the benefits of electrification. And so this is really where EV car share becomes especially important. It can provide flexible access to a vehicle without requiring every household to own one, pay for parking, manage that charging. And so I know this was a lot of content for one slide, but taken together, the main message is that cities are trying to solve a lot of problems at once: reducing emissions, lowering household costs, expanding access to opportunities, and making sure that residents of multifamily homes are included in this transition toward an electrified future. But even with all the progress cities are making right now, traditional transportation solutions still leave gaps, especially for multifamily residents. Just to reiterate a theme that I've already brought up, EVs, much like their internal combustion counterparts, can be expensive. Uh, High purchase costs are there across the board. Insurance can remain especially expensive for EVs. And at the same time, we're faced with a slow charger build out. And so while EV adoption continues to go across the country, in some areas, there can be a slower charger build out where the chargers aren't keeping pace with the number of EVs being deployed. And this can be especially slow and expensive in multifamily homes because that installation can be complex and costly. Um, Transit systems are also super essential, but they still don't meet every need within a community. Sometimes service can be infrequent and routes don't always align with daily travel patterns, particularly for off-peak service where you might be going to like a late night concert and it might be a little late for traditional transit service, or flexible trips where you might be wanting to go to multiple places in a row in a big circle before returning home. Maybe you're picking up furniture, things that you don't necessarily want to use a bus for. And ultimately, taken together, these challenges point toward a broader issue in that many people lack access to flexible, affordable vehicle options, leaving a pretty clear gap in the mobility landscape right now. But thankfully, this is where EV car share can come in. And just to talk about the basics of what that means, since I haven't really defined it yet, it represents short-term, flexible, on-demand rentals of EVs. And so this is where you're typically reserving a vehicle by the hour. Vehicles have dedicated charging, dedicated parking, and you can drive to locations that aren't served by transit. You can pick up that furniture. You can take pets to the vet. Um, but one thing that I want to emphasize is that car share and ride share are different concepts. When you think about rideshare, our Ubers and Lyfts of the world, they operate in a similar way that you reserve your ride, but someone comes and picks you up and takes you to where you need to go. With Carshare, you are in the driver's seat. You will have that vehicle when you reserve it, but then you will take it to the destinations of interest. And then at the end of your journey, you'll either return it within a defined operational zone or take it back to the charger where you reserved it at, depending on how the service is structured. Um, in terms of the benefits that you get with using EV car share, the top one that I would mention is lower cost per trip compared to internal combustion engines. EVs are just inherently a lot more energy efficient than gasoline cars, and most of the time, electricity is much cheaper than gas, and so you get cheaper trips overall. The second one is that with EVs, you have zero tailpipe emissions, and so um, whenever you're deploying EVs in those high travel areas of cities, you're actively reducing air pollution, increasing quality of life for residents along those highly trafficked corridors. And then finally, you get the benefit of shared infrastructure. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times, if you're owning an EV, you might have one charger to support the one EV in your household. Whereas with EV car share, you can have a charger supporting two, three, potentially even more vehicles. And so you're getting more bang for your buck in terms of making sure that chargers that are out in the wild are being used to their maximum benefit. Taken together, this makes them a really good fit for multifamily homes. They can be placed at or near multifamily homes to support the residents, and they make a natural partnership between cities, property owners, and operators, where the cities are able to support their internal transportation, uh, mobility goals, emissions goals. Property owners are able to market this as an attractive amenity for their residents, and operators are able to get a lot of folks in one spot interested in using the service and able to generate a lot of usage from folks who are living in the buildings where the service is deployed nearby. Um, Transitioning a little bit into the work that we did directly with cities, over the course of the last year, we partnered with three cities, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Lansing, Michigan, and Northfield, Minnesota, to support the development and expansion of equitable EV car share programs. And our role was really to provide hands-on technical assistance to help them move from interest to implementation, grounded in their specific local context, where you have a really big city like Albuquerque, as opposed to smaller cities like Lansing and Northfield, and especially Northfield, where it's primarily a college town. Um, Also, photo credit to Fourth and Albuquerque for the photo used in the slide. This was from some of the great community engagement work they did with residents at their first site. And so what we did to support them was first we mapped city travel patterns. We really wanted to understand where are folks going right now. Where are folks from low and moderate income communities traveling to? Where are folks living in multifamily homes traveling to? Are they typically going to grocery stores, healthcare? And using that information, we identified key deployment zones. These were areas where we think that if Carshare were to be put in specific areas within each of these communities, we think they would see a lot of trips happening, a lot of users reserving the vehicles. Um, in parallel with a lot of this data science work, we interviewed Carshare programs to learn their best practices. And so specifically, we explored the different business models, financial outlooks, and funding opportunities available to all of them. And tying it all together, we supported stakeholder engagement, where we helped the cities connect with operators, property owners, and community partners to build the relationships needed to actually launch and sustain these programs at scale. And so, as I mentioned, as part of this work, we conducted interviews with a range of EV car share operators to understand how the different business models function in practice and the challenges that they face. And broadly, we saw that they fit into three different buckets. The first of which are cooperative models. Typically, these are owned and governed by the members they serve or by community-based structures. And the emphasis here is usually on local control and affordability, which makes them really well aligned with community needs and priorities. Similarly, but not entirely overlapping, are nonprofit models where the focus is similarly mission driven, a lot of times centered on equity and improving access to transportation. And the pricing in these models is usually designed to keep costs as low as possible while still maintaining operations and ensuring the program can continue over time. And then last but not least are for-profit models, where here the programs rely on user fees to cover their operating costs, and they're also designed to generate profit that can later be reinvested into growth and expansion. And so this means that financial performance is a key driver of decision making, but in the long run, this can also support scalability for the programs. And so across all three models, you see different priorities at play. Um, Sometimes it's community control, sometimes it's equity, sometimes it's financial sustainability. And these priorities really shape how each service operates. In terms of the pros and cons of each business model, what really stood out is that there's no one size fits all approach. Each comes with its own strengths and trade-offs. And so maybe to start with cooperatives, they do tend to have that really strong community input and they're aligned with city goals a lot of times. But because there is less of a central leadership, sometimes it can take more time to generate buy-in from the user base for those operational changes and to get them enacted. And they can also face limited access to capital sometimes. Similar story for nonprofits. You typically get good program alignment with public goals, um, but long-term sustainability can be a challenge if ridership doesn't reach a certain level. And we also heard that staffing can sometimes be a constraint, especially when you have programs that are spread across a large number of sites, a large number of cities. Making sure that you have the administrative support to support the service can be a challenge if not monitored well. And then with for-profits, typically you see a greater operational efficiency in terms of being able to make decisions quickly. Because they're adapting to market conditions pretty quickly, they're able to be a little more nimble. A lot of times they also have strong technology platforms, like really smooth apps that improve the user experience. Sometimes telematics data from the vehicles where you're getting information on where the vehicle's going, how far the vehicle's driving, really detailed metrics that can help them make decision making going forward in terms of how they adapt their service to on the ground conditions over time. Uh, but with that, profitability can still be challenging just because the margins remain thin and the demand is inconsistent in terms of there's never a guarantee of knowing when folks are going to be reserving vehicles, knowing that service is pretty variable from day to day. But some lessons did rise to the top as being pretty across the board messages that cities should be aware of when they're considering starting or expanding their EV car share programs. The first that we heard pretty consistently was that maintenance, administration, and outreach are critical for smooth operation. And so making sure that vehicles are available at sites, not out for repairs all the time, making sure that support is there whenever users do run into issues, are really key for making sure that the users feel supported and encouraged to use the service. The second one that we heard was that students can play a really interesting role in this ecosystem. Placing car share sites at or near college campuses can provide high frequency users that could support cars in other locations. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times college students are eager to use the new technology, really savvy and excited to try the new service. And whenever they're paying market rate for reserving these vehicles, that can free up revenue to support cars in other locations like low and moderate income multifamily housing. The third one I think is a fairly obvious one, but still one worth calling out, and that density matters. And so when you're deploying your sites, figuring out where you want to put them, making sure that they're in high population areas, areas with a lot of commercial activity where they're visible from roadways, near transit stops. Overall, make sure that the vehicles are being utilized a lot and improves the financial stability for programs on the whole. And finally, returning to a theme I've already mentioned a few times is insurance barriers. Similar to private vehicle ownership, insurance can be a key challenge for EV car share programs, and especially for smaller services. Just the amount of money that has to go into the insurance considerations can be quite steep. And so, to the extent that cities can work to address those costs early, is beneficial. Tying this together into a narrative for what cities need to be thinking about as they explore car share programs. First, I would say start with clear goals and target your users accordingly. Being able to know from the top um, whether you're focusing on expanding access or focusing on reducing emissions, lowering costs, is really critical for deciding how you're going to define success for your program. A lot of the successful programs that are out there, they didn't happen by accident. They were really intentionally designed from the start. And so being clear-eyed about what you set out to achieve is huge. From there, you really want to make sure that you prioritize the right locations for your site, making sure that they're in those high density areas, making sure they're visible, close to transit. Those are all key ways to making sure that users are going to be encouraged to use the service. From there, really make sure to focus on designing for accessibility and adoption. And so simple things like easy enrollment, flexible pricing, all of these improve the user experience and minimize friction to help drive adoption and make folks want to use the service. Partnerships are also a big part of the picture. Cities, operators, property owners, community organizations, they all bring different pieces to the table. And in particular, trusted local partners are essential for outreach and making sure that programs actually meet community needs. And having clear roles and strong coordination upfront helps avoid issues as these programs scale and become more complex. And then on support, it comes down to both funding and policy. Many programs do require sustained investment, not just startup funding. And cities can play a big role in this ecosystem by doing things on the policy side, like streamlining permitting, dedicating space for car share, and aligning policies to make deployment easier. And so, over the long run, planning for things like vehicle replacement, stable revenue streams, and ongoing performance tracking so that you can tailor your service is really key to keeping programs viable and effective. And so from here, I would just want to say thank you for sticking with me this far. We do have a Q&A box in the Zoom panel, and so I encourage you that as questions come up, please continue to share your questions with us, and we will answer as many of those as possible during the Q&A. And from here, I will just want to thank you again, and I will pass it back to Ellen to cover our panel talking with folks about real-world EV car share experiences.
Thank you so much, Nakona, and I really appreciate the background that's been shared. I hope that it's been useful for our audience. And now we're going to transition a little bit from the principles of EV car share into the practice of it. And so welcoming again, Courtney, Creighton, Rye, and Peter. I wondered if we can start with each of you just giving an overview of who you are, the Carshare program that you're affiliated with, the region that you work in, and what size of program you're working with, and what kinds of partnerships have been most critical to your program's success. So if we can start with Courtney, that would be great.
Thanks, Ellen. And thank you all for having me. My name is Courtney Kukisi. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a program manager at Fourth. For those unfamiliar, Fourth is an Oregon-based nonprofit working to increase equitable access to electric transportation options. I oversee a variety of programs at Fourth, but one of my biggest is the Affordable Mobility Platform. We affectionately call it AMP. AMP is a DOE-funded project that provides access to EVs at affordable housing locations in underserved communities across 8 different states. We've deployed over 50 vehicles at this point in the program, and we've installed charging infrastructure at these locations as well. We install level 2 chargers. I've spent the last year and a half managing a handful of our regional markets. So I've overseen Boise, all of our Michigan markets, along with Charlotte and St. Louis. In addition to those, I now actually oversee the program holistically. So I'm working on the entire program. We partner with a lot of different organizations, and we really rely on our partners to ensure the success of this program. We're partnered with Mobility Development, who Creighton is on this call as well. They're our operating partner. We also work with our networking partner, OpConnect. They've helped us install all of the charging infrastructure across all of these sites. And in addition to that, we have our site host partners, many of which are affordable housing developers, some of which are community centers. We work greatly with a lot of our regional partners in different clean cities coalitions, and cities and municipalities, along with certain utilities as well. So we rely on local support for a lot of work on this program, and without the local support of these organizations, I don't think that we would see them be nearly as successful as they are. So there we go.
Thank you, Courtney. I really appreciate the intro. Creighton, since you were mentioned as part of it, would you like to go next?
For sure. And hopefully my audio is coming through okay. Is
I
anybody
can
else
hear
getting an
you.
echo? Okay, great. All right. I'm just going to turn my audio off as I am. So Creighton Randall, CEO with Mobility Development. I've been doing this work since about 2008. Nice to see some familiar faces on the call. So real quickly, just sort of on region and size. So we operate in 10 states, have a footprint of just over 100 cars. We've traditionally been sort of setting up some of the smaller programs. So over the years, right now that's the programs we operate, but over the years I've also helped set up some programs, either nonprofit models or sort of public-private partnerships between a city and a private company. And yeah, the last several years for me has been really focused on this sort of long-term growth that Nakona was talking about at oftentimes small to mid-sized cities, which is sort of where we specialize. But in terms of like where we have the biggest footprint, certainly the partnership with Fourth that was mentioned earlier. We also have sort of concentrated efforts in state of Michigan, state of New York, particularly upstate New York, and also in Southern California. I would say, just in terms of like the mix of partnerships to your question, Ellen, like I think, things have obviously changed the last couple of years, right? We're lucky that we did not go after a lot of federal funding over the last 5 years. A lot of our funding does come from the state level. We do shoot for markets where we're going to, within the first 3 years, see about 50% of funding coming from the user base, coming from members paying for the program. So we find that if you're shooting kind of below that level, it's going to be tough to make it work after 3, 4, 5 years in operations. But when you look at what the remainder is, a lot of it does come from the state level. I'll say our most successful models are like Grand Rapids, Michigan, or the capital region in New York, where you've got some state funding, but you also have a lot of local participation, either the city or the transit agency or utility also contributing.
Thank you for that, Creighton. Since you emphasized how important and impactful it can be to engage at the state level, Peter, would you mind telling us what's happening in Colorado?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you. And just a sound check, am I okay?
You sound great.
Great. Thanks for having me. Peter Crahan-Buell, and I'm the executive director at Colorado Carshare. Also do sit on the board of the Car Sharing Association, which is a global entity. So plenty of great resources there, including an upcoming conference this fall in Vancouver. Um, in the Colorado context, so we're about a almost 30-year young nonprofit. We're about 28, 29 years old. We've grown from a grassroots level very organically and focused on sort of our mission in two ways. One has been around our education, advocacy, and outreach, helping to educate residents in Colorado about finding alternative ways to get there better, including all of the complementary modes of transportation that CarShare supports and oftentimes fills that last gap. So we do a lot of the education on that side. And then operationally, as we're discussing here today, operating as a car share organization. We probably, I'd say we're at around 70+% earned income, meaning the revenue that we receive from our members. Our goal is to be as self-sustaining as possible. At the same time, we're always trying to educate and work with our municipalities and other partners that they should be thinking of car sharing as a form of public transit, maybe think of it as self-drive public transit. And so how can we get our partners to kind of contribute and be a part of the equation that way? We have a fleet currently of around 60 vehicles. We're primarily in the Denver Boulder metro area. We're over a third electrified. We're to today's topic specifically, which is a great conversation. We're learning about the very steep learning curve of electrifying when you're transitioning an entire fleet from ICE cars in remote dispersed locations. We're also looking, hopefully this year, with some state funding, as you mentioned, Ellen, to get us over on the western slopes into some of the more rural areas around Grand Junction, Glenwood Springs, and some smaller rural communities. And what else? You asked about partnerships. I mentioned a few. We found are finding and have found that a massive important relationship and partnership when it comes to electrifying car sharing, particularly in mixed income communities and multifamily areas, is with the utility company. So in our case, working a lot with Xcel Energy over the last few years, definitely the housing authorities. Those are huge, right? Because from the mission side, since our approach is really focused on the equity component and working in a lot of lower income communities that maybe wouldn't be self-fulfilling on their own. But then we also work in what I call the market rate areas, like more dense downtown Denver areas, for example, that helps to balance that out. It's really important that we combine the partnership with the utility companies, with the housing authorities, with the cities, definitely with other mobility providers that you can complement and work together with. And then finally, I'd say with some other nonprofits that might be helping out in your space. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear about the progress being made and also to hear about the impact on the local level. Right. I was wondering if you could take us into the unique model that ZEV is operating to be impactful on the local level.
Certainly. Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Armstrong. I use they, them pronouns based up here in Seattle. I'm the new executive director of ZEV Co-op, so I'm glad to be here. Our model is very much a unique, not 501c3, but Washington state recognized nonprofit of a co-op where I like to say if REI and Zipcar had a baby, that's kind of the model that we're trying to go after. Great to be here. I think also in terms of our region, we are very lucky in Washington state to have this kind of I know this is a nonpartisan event, but blue bubble protecting some of this government funding around EVs. And so in particular, we're seeing a lot of growth in our region, specifically around EV infrastructure. And we're very grateful to our partners in the South, down in Portland, Fourth. We love Fourth. So we also had an opportunity to incubate a new car share called Light City Carshare, which is launching in Buffalo, New York, through a partnership with Lisk and NYSERDA. And so that's going to be an interesting kind of incubation of a new entity and see where they go off and thrive. So the space is always evolving, and I think that especially with gas prices increasing and the uncertainty of what tomorrow brings, EV car share is not going to go anywhere anytime soon.
Amen to that. And hooray, all at the same time. So, as our audience is thinking about how to get started, this is an all play question. Wondering if you can dive in and share with us what cities and property owners should be thinking about and really understand when thinking about hosting EV car share, particularly at multifamily sites, since that tends to be an area where it can be particularly impactful. For instance, how would you approach resident engagement and onboarding, especially for these communities, and help them to understand the value of these programs?
I know I just spoke, but I could kick us off if that works.
Please do.
Um, I would say community is the number one thing with our model. If you're not actually listening to the local community, you're not going to find out what people's needs really are. We take a lot of intentional time to do surveys and outreach and targeted social media engagement with our communities to make sure that they know the cars exist, that they know how to actually plug in an EV. It's so funny how many people won't like wait for the EVSE box to actually click and start charging, holding the RFID card. So there's little nuances where you have to teach the culture. I think specifically in Washington State, we're interested in pursuing, we have a 1% for the arts for new construction. And so how could we take that model to say, could transportation have a similar aspect? Could there be a tax incentive for developers to, instead of creating so much parking, maybe allocate 2 spots for car share for that community, for that building? And so I think the conversation we're having is decreasing carbon footprint by allowing for that access to the car share. But I'm curious to hear from everyone else what you all think in terms of engaging community.
I can maybe not specifically on the engaging community side. I can talk to that also, but building off of the question around how, what can cities do to incorporate EV car sharing and multifamily? I think one of the things that I've learned over the years, particularly from the Denver and Boulder experience, has been engaging with the cities and the fragmented different departments focused on different things with different priorities and different responsibilities and different goals, right? So you have transportation department, housing, parking, energy. They might not all be talking to each other. So having to work over the years to try to like navigate all the different departments, I feel like when municipalities can understand that EV car sharing and multifamily and affordable housing communities ticks like every box for everything that you could ever want related to, transportation, reduction in transportation, cars off the road, parking mitigation, affordable housing, climate resiliency, renewable energy, like it all comes together. And so like, for example, one of our great relationships has been with not new, but relatively new CASR department, climate action, sustainability, and resiliency. And it kind of cuts across these different departments, or at least has a home for us to then be able to connect with the different departments, bringing in, street side parking through Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, bring together the Housing Authority, et cetera. And I found that, and the engagement and education and outreach, particularly as it relates to multifamily and through the Housing Authority. So I think if we can just help our municipal partners to understand that it's all interconnected and we can help bring those departments together, including public transportation, then we can find some good solutions out there with them.
I would also love to chime in. I really, really like this question because I do a lot of our day-to-day engagement with our site hosts and work on the community engagement aspect in terms of acquiring new users for the program. So one thing that I would say, especially when engaging at affordable housing locations, is the importance of having actual property management contacts at the site. I think one of our big lessons learned is as we worked through our contracting with our site hosts, obviously we're working with kind of higher ups for development organizations. And when it comes to actual deployment and engaging communities, property managers know their properties the best. They know their residents on site. They know the people that are on the ground. And having those contacts at a property level not only make it easier when we have a small issue, hey, can you please help us plug in the car? Somebody forgot to do that. It's a lot easier when we have somebody on the ground that we can just send them a text or an email and asking them to do that. But in addition to that, I think that there's a decent amount of turnover at a lot of affordable housing locations. And I've spoken to some property managers that talk about marketing Carshare as an asset that they have at their property. When they're showing potential new residents a unit, they will mention the fact that there's Carshare on site that is available for them to use. So having those on the ground champions of the programs are just such a really, really great way for people to find out about the program, and also to just have better engagement at a site-wide level. One particular example that we have is in Charlotte, North Carolina. There is a gentleman that lives at one of those properties that we have Carshare at, and he became very interested in the program early on, started using it, became a somewhat ambassador of the program on the ground in Charlotte. He's been quoted in local news outlets talking about how much he loves the program. And in addition to that, he's now actually has part-time employment as a as an on-the-ground contractor for mobility development. So really, really great user case story of the fact that having on-the-ground engagement really enables better engagement across the site. He's able to talk to other residents that live there. He's able to show people how to use EVs if they're not familiar with the technology. So having that kind of on the ground person can really make a huge difference in increasing engagement.
I love that
Just sort
story.
of building off of what Courtney's saying there, like Charlotte's a great example because we struggled a lot with that market. Like, what's the minimum size that you need to make this viable? And so the team member, his name's Lucius. There, like we were we needed to get to like 3-4 locations before we could bring him on as a contractor, right? And so I think just to answer the kind of mechanics side of the question, right? Like isolated sites don't work. If you've got one location, 2 locations, and those 2 locations are far apart, or those 2 locations are 10 miles from another couple, cars, or an hour away, it's probably not going to work long term. So I would sort of caution folks not to think of just isolated affordable housing sites without kind of a larger context. There's also, so our programs are all electric, right? And that, as Peter mentioned, that's a challenge. So with all electric programs, we also cannot look at isolated sites from a charging standpoint, right? When we're kind of zooming into the map, we need to look at what else is out there. So maybe this affordable housing developer is willing to put infrastructure in, but what else is out there? What else is out there when we look at other sites? What else is out there for our members, maybe to fast charge in between trips, or the beginning or end of their trip if they're getting to a car that has 40% charge or 50% charge at the start of their trip. On the engagement side, I think I would maybe take a slightly different tack, which is to say, so most of our users are low, moderate income. Most of our users are living in Black and brown communities, are people of color themselves. And in general, I think we find that our membership base has been kind of over-surveyed and over-promised, right? So there's always a danger of like focusing so much on the community engagement as opposed to the long-term operating model that you might want to say yes to a program that doesn't actually have viability. And that's kind of one of the concerns that we really kind of put at the first step for us when we're looking at a community are you going to be able to get to a point in year 3 where this thing is going to have some legs to it? Because if not, you might be feeling really good about yourself and what you're telling this community, but ultimately, are you really doing a service to the community if you're not going to be around in 3 years? So that's something we take pretty seriously at the front end. And particularly like California, to some degree, New York State, states that have been doing this for a long time, they do tend to build their state programs around pretty heavy duty community needs assessment or community engagement on the front end. But again, even at the state level, sometimes we find that those structures for grant making sometimes will lead to those short-term outcomes, but not the long-term outcomes.
I think you all have given us some really important insights about how critical it is to have partnership, engagement, a local champion, to be realistic and transparent about what is possible, to engage early and often. So thank you very much for those answers. I'm interested if we can shift a little bit into talking about some of the challenges, and particularly the operational challenges with EV Carshare today. If you'd be willing to touch on that, as well as where cities can best help with those and overcoming those.
I'm happy to kick off, I guess, the context in Denver, and I think they're already working diligently on finding solutions for other forms of transportation outside of EV car sharing, but it's access to charging in public right-of-ways on busy streets where people have to walk across sidewalks, and there's scooters going everywhere, and all of these things. How do they prioritize getting charge stations out the door, so that it coincides with where we already have vehicles, for example, that are doing well versus, okay, maybe there's a grant or some state funding or something else in another area in a multifamily or in a mobility hub or whatever. And then we have to kind of prioritize, do we want to be where we're at and it's only a hybrid or an ICE car and we're still taking 10 cars off the road there versus going somewhere else. So there's that cost component and the policy component and the priority component that cities, I think, are dealing with, for us anyways. So whether it's inside of multifamily or street side next to a multifamily, that's always a challenge. There, I think, no, I'd love to hear from other speakers on what some of their challenges are, but that's a big one for us.
There's a couple things I'll highlight. The first is insurance. Peter, I'm sure is
Oh yeah,
insurance is
it's big.
Just has always been a concern. I think will always be a major concern. Although car sharing is mature as a mode, we both benefited from and have, I think, had been, kind of pulled down by this explosion of shared mobility stuff in the last decade, right? So a lot of the other programs, whether it's getting in a car with somebody you don't know or getting on a device that, is a little bit, top heavy once you get on it, right? These are both somewhat dangerous, risky activities, right? And so what that means is that one of the biggest sort of cost inflation areas for our work has been around risk, as well as around just like body work. Like the cost of repairing your cars has just gone through the roof in the last 5 years. So, we spend a much bigger chunk of our resources on insuring our vehicles and on repairing vehicles. It's also not a particularly predictable expense for our partners. If you're a small city that's hosting a 5 or 10 car program and you have 1 car total, that's a pretty big deal, right? So I'd highlight that as a challenge. The other, and this is maybe a very broad answer to your question, but I think like any business or nonprofit, we look for stability. We look for like stable rules, stable, vendor options, right? Like the charging ecosystem is not as mature of an industry as we'd like, right? So we have a lot of challenges dealing with various charging vendors. I won't name names, but the same's true for like federal policy, right? Like we see ourselves as kind of building out car sharing that's like a public utility. Peter, you mentioned transit, right? We do see ourselves as transit, but we're we're more building out a series of community clinics than we are building out like a big general hospital, right? And there's not a lot of guidance. There's not a lot of federal rules set up. There's not a lot of expectations set up around performance, around standards. So I feel like in general, there's just an overall need for, I think, kind of maturation of our industry, but also particularly from the federal level, some rules. If you're going to build a public utility, you need to have some standards in place, and we just don't really have those as an industry just yet.
Thank you, Creighton. Before we go on with operational challenges, and not to derail us, but you had touched on insurance, and we did have a question from the audience about how that works, like who needs to carry it, the site host, the driver, the operators, etc. Would you be willing to address that quickly?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is, as an operator, we take on pretty much all the risk. Different operators will tell you that they take on risk differently. The way a nonprofit handles risk is different than the way a private company handles risk. States vary widely in what their expectations are, but in general, whether it's commercial general liability, somebody might slip and fall at a location that's ours, or somebody's in a vehicle or is involved in a crash with one of our vehicles. The short answer is that the operator holds that risk and often additionally insures their partners on the project, whether it's another nonprofit or a government, against those risks.
Thank you for that. Courtney and Rye, just pivoting back on the operations question and the challenges, also wondered if, and we have another question from the audience, whether you have any insights on what role local governments can play in rural car share deployment.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch a little bit on some of the other operational challenges. Creighton touched on many of them. Like I said, mobility development is our operating partner, so the same pain points we have, they certainly have as well. But just to kind of add on to that a little bit, I think maintenance can be pretty difficult, specifically when it comes to lead times on parts. I wish that cities could do more to assist with that, but unfortunately, if the parts aren't available, our hands are tied and we aren't able to redeploy vehicles in a timely fashion. So that can be a little bit challenging. Also alignment with utilities, which I know Creighton had touched on a little bit, but there are just certain utilities that we've worked with where it takes months and months and months to get a level 2 charger up and running, and not having the ability to launch those chargers prevents us from being able to launch sites. So I think any sort of coordinated effort that can be made with cities and utilities to help sort of speed up those processes. Again, that can be a little bit challenging because a lot of the time utilities operate pretty interdependently of cities, but any type of coordinated support that the two can have together is really, really helpful. In terms of something that I think a city can do, that they have the power to do, is assist with wayfinding. So when it comes to amplifying these programs, especially if we're working with an affordable housing developer, sometimes their parking might be kind of situated away from the street. You just can't see it. You wouldn't know that the cars are there. So if the cities are helping amplify the message of the program, any type of wayfinding that can be signage that can be provided on a street level that actually points people to the direction of the cars, I think can really, really benefit a program and help people know that it even exists to service them.
And to charging too, right?
And to charge as well. Yeah.
Right. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, we actually had a vehicle attempted theft yesterday occur, and so I think it also depends on your immobilization and hardware software. We work with Inverse, and so the vehicle was immobilized, and They even stabbed around the actual car handle to try to get in. And so now we have to replace the entire driver's side door. And I think all of that is just to say a vehicle that is more in the open and more in community and visible is less likely to experience those things. This was hidden on the second floor of a parking garage. So also, I think the EVSE hookup is super important. There are new kind of innovations with retractable cables that we are really finding successful, where the initiation of that box will then pull the cable out and then you can charge the actual vehicle. And as long as it's live and charging, no one's going to cut that cable for copper, but we've had cables cut, as I'm sure many of our other friends have. So I think that's all to say, going back to your second question of rural communities, I think they are some of the most important communities to reach out to. We have, I answered in the chat and the Q&A, we have 2 sites in Port Townsend, Washington, and those connect those 2 vehicles to nonprofits and partners that otherwise wouldn't be able to make their way to the ferry in such a waterlocked area as Washington State is and around the Puget Sound. So yeah, I would say there's a lot of different methods of how we're figuring out how to deal with these situations, but insurance, like Creighton said, is very much the guillotine over our head about how much is that going to increase? Do you actually want to file this claim against insurance, or could a grant pay for it? And as the pseudo hybrid co-op, not 501c3, but state nonprofit, we kind of have the best of both worlds in terms of these grant partners and also the ability to get investment for individuals to make those changes.
Well, thank you all very much for sharing these insights. I wish that we had more time to mine your experience and your expertise, but I recognize that we're almost at closing. I'd ask quickly if there was anything that a city that was interested in getting a program started could do over the next year. Are there any thoughts quickly to share on that?
I would say probably reach out to Fourth for their materials because they have a lot of great write-ups about Carshare. Also, MoveMe has some great white papers as well. But really, it's just reaching out to the players in this room and asking questions and being curious and being hungry for the EV revolution that is coming, whether we like it or not. And then I'll pass it to my partners here if anyone else has thoughts.
Well, thank you for the plug, Rye. I really appreciate that. Yes, I would encourage folks to reach out to Fourth. Our contacts are on our website. You're also welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. We do have a lot of resources that we have created around our years of work in a variety of different car share programs. In addition to that, in terms of I recognize that funding can be tight for a lot of organizations, for a lot of cities. And I think one challenge is the fact that cities are building out their budgets typically years in advance before it actually comes to deploying. So one thing that I would say, if there's funding constraints, build on existing things that are happening within the city already, especially when it comes to marketing and outreach of programs. If you're having an event that's being thrown by the city, build on it, showcase the car share. So it doesn't, while funding is always going to be a need in this space, I would say that whatever opportunities there are that are existing where car share can be added on as like an additive thing that's being promoted, I think that that's a really handy way to sort of work around some funding constraints that might exist when you're talking about marketing programs.
Anything to add from Peter or Creighton?
I feel like we've covered a lot already. So
Okay.
our colleagues are awesome. Definitely, like I said, check out the Car Sharing Association. And as we've learned over the last nearly 3 decades, it's all about relationships, 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 and just like aligning on the fact that this is a partnership and a relationship between your mobility provider and your municipality really goes a long way.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And as folks mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out. We're all interested in helping others to grow this community here.
Okay. Well, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to RMI or to any of our speakers to get more information. And thank you to all of our panelists for your passion, for your expertise, and for your continued hard work to make these programs fly. We so appreciate you and celebrate all the work you put in. Hope you all have a great day.